Yeah, thanks for having me.
I was introduced to Paige virtually by my wife. We're sitting beside each other in bed, and normally we just like throw each other like an Instagram short that we like or a TikTok that we like through the messaging apps. But this was big enough where my wife like gave me an elbow in the rib and told me, "Oh my God, you've got to see this. You're gonna love this
Oh,
woman. You're gonna love everything she's sharing." And instantly reached out to Paige because I loved her messaging and I love the fact that she's pointing out still some of the challenges that couples continue to face, in particular, women continue to face. And right away, I knew that this would be an opportunity for us as husbands to learn and find ways to be better partners, to be better teammates for our spouses. So that is how I was introduced to Paige, and thrilled that she was able to join us here on our podcast. And if you don't follow her on Instagram or TikTok, did I almost say TikTok?
hey, it's hard.
You're there aren't you're one of only a few who don't follow her. She's got a massive following. So anyhow, I want to go ahead and go straight into you sharing just a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind, and maybe begin with sharing with our listeners a little bit about your family.
Sure. So I am a mom of four kids. My oldest is turning 7 tomorrow, and my youngest just turned 2. So they're all pretty young still. And so I've really been in the thick of it, parenting wise. I have been with my husband for 18 years. We're high school sweethearts. And so we've been together a very long time. And yeah, we are both working parents. We both work full time. He's a blue collar guy. I work from home at my desk. And then obviously, I do content creation on the side. Our family also, I think it's important to note, grew very quickly because our oldest two are adopted. We fostered them and then did ultimately end up adopting them. And so we went from 0 kids to 4 kids in 3.5 years. And so, when I talk about the dynamics of my relationship, I think that context is important because
Mhm.
so much change so quickly as it does when you become a parent. And I think that plays a huge role in the dynamics that existed in my home.
And you really are in the thick of it. And when I see you post things, there are some problems that you share where there's just no solution, and I feel so bad for you. There was one in particular a couple weeks ago that you shared where some of your kids share a bedroom, and one of them is just now getting out of the crib and causing chaos for the other one and keeping them up. And
Hmm.
there's no good solution for that. And if you aren't a parent, you might think to yourself, oh, that's cute. And it's not cute at all,
It's not
because what
cute.
that means is nobody's sleeping. You're not sleeping, your husband, the kids aren't sleeping. And
Hmm.
so what I love about what you share is like real problems where there aren't necessarily solutions all the time, but there's certainly ways to maybe kind of handle that. I've got to ask, how did you handle that situation?
It's still in flux. My 6-year-old has decided to leave the bedroom. She sets up a cot in the hallway now because she just doesn't even want to be in the room with her sister. She's crazy. And I've offered her my bed. I'm like, go to sleep in my bed. She's like, no, I'm just going to sleep in the hallway. I'm like, okay. And so then I have to carry her back to bed later at night. I think the toddler will eventually get bored of the chaos that she is causing. But there isn't a great solution for a toddler who has jumped the bed or the crib because it's dangerous, unfortunately. So,
Yeah.
we dropped the wall. There are some things you can do, but we've converted to a toddler bed earlier than we would have liked, and we are just still figuring it out. But it is getting better. It's getting better.
You're a better parent than me, because the first thing I would have done is gone to Google and put in like how young is too young to give them NyQuil. I
Oh
don't
yeah.
know what
I
what else to
know, I know.
do.
I know people are like, "What about melatonin?" I'm like, "She's 2. She cannot get she can't. She's too little." I mean, we were desperate. I mean, I went to the internet. I was desperate for tips.
Sure.
And it was yeah, the longest 2 weeks ever of just her being so chaotic in there, but I think we're finding our groove. Everything's a phase. That's what people will tell you about parenting. It's all a phase and it changes very quickly.
Hmm. Now let's start with the problem that gets the headlines and the press. So that is, the cost of childcare. So
Mhm.
how does the cost of childcare impact your family and others who follow you?
Sure. So I've talked a lot about the cost of childcare and how my family personally deals with it because we pay a lot of money for childcare. We live in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of the most expensive states for
Mhm.
childcare. And depending on what kind of childcare you have, it is actually the most expensive state. And so, on average, a family will pay about $20,000 a year for one child in full time childcare. And that obviously is the average. So it can be lower, it can be higher, and it depends on what kind of childcare you have, whether that's a nanny or a daycare or whatever that might be. On average, the last 3 or so years, my husband and I have spent about $60,000 a year on childcare. And
Mm,
that is a mix of daycare full time for our youngest kids, after school care, or camp as well. Because if you have school age kids and you work full time, typically you
right.
take advantage of camp. And I like to say it is not, I'm not talking about like fancy luxury sleepaway camp. I'm talking about day camp. I think regionally people talk about it in different ways. They'll call it like daycare, but it's for school age kids. Where I live, we call it summer camp. But when I talk about camp, I'm talking about like a day camp, 9 to 3, which is incredibly expensive as well. And so the cost of childcare is something that is unaffordable for many and or most, and it's inaccessible. Many people just can't access childcare. It's something you think that you will have when you have children, but what I have come to find out, as have many other parents, especially post-pandemic, is that there is a childcare shortage and crisis. There is not enough available childcare for the amount of children that need it, and that leads to people going with childcare solutions that are not as safe as they would like, or not up to par when it comes to quality. And that is a huge problem in our country. So not only can families not afford it, but they can't even find it to begin with.
And I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that childcare does not end when they go to school. That's a myth,
Nope.
and it's a dangerous myth because people budget for that. They expect to have a new, kind of quote windfall of money that they were spending on childcare to now use on other things. And the fact is that when your kids go to school, what that means is now that you have summer childcare, as you said, it's day camps, however you want to define it. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have other expenses too, and they just keep on going. If when your kids are 8 or 9, if they're really athletic, then now all of a sudden you might get introduced into the expensive and crazy world of select sports. And there's,
Mm-hmm.
arts, and it goes on and on. So anyhow, I know that it's a big problem for young families, any family really that has young children. And for us, the locus of control is kind of like what we can do about it. Like, obviously there's systemic changes that can be discussed. But unfortunately, we have pretty limited opportunities to be able to do that individually. So understanding, just like focusing on our locus of control, can you walk us through how working husbands can use parental leave to
Mm-hmm.
support their spouses and children?
Sure. So I think it's important to talk about also the dynamic that currently exists in our country, and we're in the US here, but um, the majority of homes are dual income homes. I think
Yep.
oftentimes people think about a family and they do think that one parent is staying at home and or even working part-time. But the reality is most families are dual income, and oftentimes women are earning similar amounts to their partner at this point in time. And so, careers are on the up for both parents typically right as they are having children. And so
Yep.
when I think about how my husband and I have tackled it is kind of multi-layered, right? First and foremost, I think we have to think about how we talk about the cost of childcare as a issue of the family and not as the woman, because oftentimes you'll hear the narrative that if her salary doesn't cover the cost of childcare, then it's not worth it. But that really discredits her earning potential, her career potential, and just her long-term goals as a person, and is very short-sighted because, to your point, childcare costs last well beyond the age of 5 when they're entering public school age. And with your earning potential increasing, right, in the future, you can kind of still grow the family finances while paying for childcare. So
I
I
if,
think it's
and
really, oh, go
if you
ahead.
don't mind, Paige, I want to interject something really important
Yes,
there.
please.
We had Mel Faxon on in the past, and she has a program where essentially she illustrates to companies the long term financial implications of females leaving the workforce by year. And the reason that they focus on females is because, as you said, in many parts of the country, the default is whether her salary covers childcare, where in 40% of households, women make the same, if not more than men. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, the default is that. Yet a college educated woman who leaves the workforce for 1 year loses $250,000 over her lifetime of income, and that total compensation, that includes retirement. And that's not just her income. We have to look at it, as you said, as a household. That's household
Hmm.
income, right? So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's not a singular decision. It does not happen in like it's not compartmentalized. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so I had to
Yeah.
interject there because you hit a passion point for me. So go ahead.
No, me too. Yeah. And I think, when we think about parental leave and how that ties into this, right? Parental leave is something that I think every parent should have access to, but I know most don't. We know that our country doesn't have
Yeah.
the infrastructure and funding set up to support parents in that way. And so you're typically at the whim of your employer or your state. I again, I'm in Massachusetts. We do have paid family medical leave here now, but teachers don't qualify. Right. So people who
Yeah.
are having children, even in the state of Massachusetts, still don't have access to this paid leave. And even if they do, oftentimes it's not your full pay. Right. And if your company's not willing to bridge the gap, it is something that will impact your family financially. And so I want to state that I understand how difficult it can be to take an unpaid leave and or a paid leave that is not your full compensation, because it does mean that you are sacrificing somewhere financially.
Right.
However, most men work, and I say most men, most male dominated fields actually have fantastic paternity leave. Huge companies, Fortune 500 companies, they will offer a fully paid 6-month parental leave to both men and women, with the assumption that most of their employees are men and they won't take it. And the men often don't take it because they are fearful for the repercussions and the loss of income if they do, right? If they take that paid leave, even if it's available to them, they are worried that, similar to women who experience the motherhood penalty, they will lose out on lifetime earning, retirement savings, opportunities for promotions. They will be viewed differently in the workforce if they take that leave. And so they don't. But what happens in that dynamic is twofold. One, it creates even further inequities for women in the workplace, because men are seen as these workers who they're never a flight risk, right? Nobody's ever questioning whether or not a man is going to leave the workforce for a period of time or indefinitely due to the fact they have children. And so companies will place their bets on men more often than women because they don't view them as this risk factor. For women, though, it also creates inequities at home, because what will happen is they are the person taking the parental leave. So let's say she gets 4 months, which is generous. I only got 8 weeks, right, for most of my kids. She takes 4 months. She's probably the person doing the bulk of the domestic labor during that time. She's washing the bottles, folding the laundry, cleaning the house, taking care of the baby. She's doing all of the overnights because her husband has work in the morning. And so she's willing to do the overnights because he says he can't be tired at work, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
what happens is she goes back to work at 4 months and she keeps doing all of those things because they've set up a pattern. They have set up a behavior and a dynamic within their relationship where she has taken on that role and that responsibility because he was working during that time. But now she's returned to work and she hasn't been able to hand back any of these new responsibilities because they actually didn't exist before the baby, right? There weren't bottles, there weren't like 17 loads of laundry. So they're not going back to the time before, they're creating a new dynamic. And
Right.
oftentimes this is where couples find that resentment starts to build because
Yep.
one person is not only working full time but bearing the brunt of the domestic responsibilities and caretaking, and the other person's life has remained somewhat unchanged other than the fact that there's now a child at home. And so this is where parental leave really comes into play, because if men are taking that parental leave, they can start to own those parts of being a parent and the domestic labor that comes with it.
We had on David Smith from Johns Hopkins University. He's an expert in this area. And one of the things that he was talking about with parental leave, paternity leave in particular, like why men don't necessarily take it, and this was frustrating to hear, is that companies are offering it. And I don't remember the statistic, but it's growing pretty quickly. But the challenge is that in areas of the country who don't necessarily look at paternity leave in the same way other areas of the country would look at it, or you and I would look at it, that even though the policy exists, that there are managers, typically middle managers, who will absolutely punish him or fire him and can get away with
Hmm.
it, just because culturally it's not accepted yet. It's kind of like where, when it comes to this, where women were for maternity leave 25, 30 years ago, right? And there's these growing pains that are going throughout our system as it's kind of like the nastiness is being flushed out. That's really frustrating to deal with, because from the perspective of a father, of course you want to stay home with your children. And it's not just about, trying to support your wife and manage everything as a team, but it's also the opportunity to bond with your children and how important that is. And there's so much science behind how much that can improve just that, not only a father's well-being, but also the long-term implications of a child's development. And so
Yeah.
for our listeners, like, if you are a manager, the advice David Smith gave that really stuck with me is that when you have children, take your paternity leave loudly, meaning
Yes.
leave the office for a doctor's appointment. And I know that's not paternity leave, but leave to take care of your children loudly, like during the day, and make sure people know why you're leaving. If you're on paternity leave, make that a part of your away message. Don't say I'm away from my desk for 2 months. Say I'm on paternity leave. So people feel like that is more of an expectation. So anyhow, as parents transition into childcare, the mental load of managing a home can begin to take its toll. And that's what you were talking about. And like you said, that's where resentment starts to build in. So for our listeners who are unaware of what mental load is, can you explain that? And then let's talk about how couples can work together to avoid placing an unfair mental load on one spouse or another.
Sure. So people will describe the mental load in different ways, but the mental load, the way I like to describe it, is the running checklist that you have in your brain of everything you need to know and remember to make sure your household and children are taken care of, right? So I think about it as this long list that never gets shorter. It only gets longer, right?
Yep.
Because once you check off, hey, I booked that doctor's appointment, now you actually have to bring them to the doctor's appointment and remind the school that they're going to be absent, right? And every task has multiple subtasks to it. It's like an Asana board, right? Like you've got all of these subtasks for every single
Yep.
thing that has to get done. And it's the knowing as well, right? The knowing about your children. I know that my 3-year-old will only wear a dress. She refuses to wear anything but a dress. I don't offer anything but a dress. I know that, right? And my husband will try and offer her a t-shirt, and then it's like hysterical crying in the morning, right? But I know, and that's the mental load associated with getting my child dressed in the morning. And so it's just all of the things that you need to know to get a task done. And oftentimes the mental load is talked about in the context of women, but men have the mental load. Everybody has mental load. You have this
Mhm.
whether or not you have children, whether or not you're in a partnership. I often think about it in the sense of I'm one of 4 kids, and on Mother's Day, who's the person coordinating the gift for our mother? Who's the person getting the Venmos from the
Right.
siblings? Who's the person buying the card, right? That's the person carrying the mental load of that task. And it has nothing to do with having children or a partner, right? And it can still exist in those dynamics as well. And so I want to make it clear that the mental load is often talked about in the context of parenthood, but it actually exists in your life just in
Yep.
general. Everybody does have this. And so I want that to be, I think there's a stigma around the word and it's very triggering, but it is not just specific to being a parent.
Uh, when I think of the mental load, it doesn't take more than 5 seconds to think about something that's recently happened. That is a good example. Yesterday, my wife and I she went to work. She works in Midtown Atlanta. And I decided to kind of work from a place around there. And so as I start working, within 45 minutes, I get a message that my middle child, who's taking online Chinese classes, AP Chinese 2 or something that I'm not smart enough to do, is
Yeah.
freaking out because there's a problem with the online interface. And so what does
Mm.
that mean? That means that for the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm like coordinating with my child and then GABS, is the online learning system, and for the Georgia Department of Education, how to work through this. I stepped away from work for 30 to 45 minutes because of that one problem. And then my child's frustrated. So it takes me like 10 or 15 minutes to kind of relax. I lost an hour of my workday. That's just one
Yeah.
example of one problem that typically women tackle that I've decided to tackle in our marriage so my wife can continue her workday because I have the flexibility. And they go on and on and on, whether it's doctor's visits or our washer broke. There's something wrong with our washer. So what does that mean? That meant for 2.5 hours, I'm going to YouTube. I'm trying to figure out how to fix the washer. And these things add up. And if we don't shoulder that fairly between our spouses, how can we expect our spouse to shine at work if they're the
Yeah.
ones that also have to keep the house running?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, sorry. Again, you hit another
No,
passion point for me.
Yeah, somebody DM'd me the other day with an example that I thought was really good because oftentimes I think most parents are very well intentioned, right?
Yep.
And women have been it's been ingrained in us that our ultimate job is to be the caretaker, the mother, the martyr. It's our job to do everything for everyone. But women are raised that way, and oftentimes men are raised to prioritize work, right? Like they are told
Yep.
you need to have a great career, you need to earn a lot of money, you need to support your family financially. That's your job. And so it's very difficult to break out of this dynamic. And when we think about the mental load, what I have found is that actually a lot of men will step up on tasks. They will do tasks. They will cook dinner. They will
Mm-hmm.
fix the washing machine, but they will not do the full task in the sense of the prep beforehand, right? So I know you've talked to
Yeah.
Eve before, but like the
Yes.
fair play idea of
Yep.
CPE, right? Like this woman DM'd me about soccer cleats. She's like, "Hey, my husband said he was going to get the soccer cleats for all the kids, or make sure we had soccer cleats for all the kids." And she's like, "And I get my son ready for soccer practice on Thursday, and I realize he doesn't have any soccer cleats." And she says to her husband, "Hey, where's the soccer cleats?" And he's like, "Oh, they're right there. I checked. They're in the drawer." And she said, "But those are last year's. They don't fit him anymore. So those aren't his cleats, right?" And so
Yep.
he checked. There were cleats. He didn't know if they were the right size. He didn't make his kid try them on. He didn't confirm with his partner whether they were the right size or not, right? So he did part of it, but not all of it. He did the task of seeing cleats, but he didn't do the mental work, and he didn't have the knowledge to say, actually, let me look at these cleats. These cleats are a size 6. He's a size 8 now. They're not going to work. We need to buy some new cleats. And he probably doesn't maybe know where to buy the cleats and what kind of cleats he needs. And so it's really and it's a small example, right? But it happens with all sorts of tasks. And so what I've seen is a lot of men say like, "Hey, I am a really great partner." And nobody's saying you're not. But when you do part of a task, but not the full thing, it does still create more work for your partner, right? Your partner is still attached and accountable and responsible for the work, and is not fully able to unload it. It's like when you have that employee that you're constantly having to slack and be like, "Are you on time for this? Did you hit this deliverable?" Right? If you constantly have to be checking in with somebody, then they don't own that task, right? There is no accountability. They are not working on their own, and they require you to manage them. And nobody wants to manage their partner.
And nobody wants to be managed. That was the
No,
that
no.
that's the secret. Like, and it takes more time if you're just relying on your spouse to tell you what tasks to complete. That's what I love about, the overall philosophy of fair play of what Eve does is that you just own something. So back to my example from my child's Chinese class, I just own all things school related, period.
Mm,
So, and that's always just been what I've done, but anything related to school, I do it. All the forms, keeping everybody up to date with, grade cards, things like the Chinese class. And
yeah,
frankly, it is easier because if I own all of it, I don't have to go back and forth with my wife. Like, do we do this? Do we do that? Where do I contact Gavs? Do you have that email address? Like all these little things that you have to do that take time away from her and from me. I don't have to do that. She doesn't have to do it.
yeah,
And that's why
yeah,
it's so important, as you said, not to focus on the task, but the ownership of specific responsibilities, laundry, school, dishes, whatever those may be. It's just
yeah.
a more efficient way of running a home, and it's sure as heck isn't an attack on men. It's just a way to
No,
operate more as a team.
yeah,
So I want to go back to some childcare options because, like
sure.
right now, you're in the middle of this, and I know some of our listeners are just overwhelmed with the cost of childcare. Can you walk us through just the different types of childcare and then the associated costs with that?
Sure. Yeah. And this will be a kind of a long answer, but I want to give you kind of like a robust idea. But so first we'll say daycare, because I think that's That's one everybody's very familiar with. There's
Yeah.
all different kinds of daycares, but I think the two primary ones that you will think about are in-home daycare, which means you're in somebody's home. They are a licensed in-home provider. They can have X amount of children, but those children will be of varying ages. So you might have a 4-year-old and a newborn right in the same room with 1 or 2 teachers, depending on the setup. These tend to be the least expensive daycare options. They're not inexpensive, but at least where I live, it's anywhere between like $60 to $70 a day, which is still very expensive, but much less expensive than a daycare center. Now, there's daycare centers, and these can range all different kinds of ideologies, right? It could be Montessori, it could be play-based, they have all different kinds. And then within daycare centers, there's corporate centers, right? You're going to hear about KinderCare or Goddard. These are
Mm-hmm.
nationwide childcare centers, and they tend to be the most expensive, but they also tend to have amenities others don't. They will cook meals. They might wash your sheets, right? All these things. Whereas I am in a town-based daycare center. So it's a daycare center, but it's actually part of a community center in our town, and it's slightly less expensive. They don't make them lunch. They don't wash their sheets, right? I have to do all those things as a parent, but the cost is lower. And so the way daycare prices work is it's typically age-based, and it's based on ratios. So in Massachusetts, you can only have 7 infants to 2 teachers, and then it's like 9 toddlers to 2 teachers, and then it continues to go up. So as your child gets older, it gets less expensive. However, the price typically raises 3 to 10% every single year, depending on where you live. And I've even seen 20% post-pandemic for certain childcare centers. And so
Mm.
it's incredibly expensive. Again, every state is different, but where I am right now, I pay $3,000 for 2 children, and they're both toddlers. So one of my kids is like $1,800 a month. The other is like 13 or 14. But I do get a 10% resident discount and like a 10% sibling discount, right? So I'm getting a little bit of a discount on everything, which is great. There's nannies. Nannies are what most people would consider a luxury childcare. It's incredibly expensive. You can have a live-in nanny, a live-out nanny, a nanny share where a family shares a nanny.
Hmm.
You're going to be paying an hourly rate. And if you are a good employer, which I hope most people hope to be, you will be offering sick time, PTO, you'll be paying them over the table, you'll be withholding taxes.
Yeah.
Some families offer benefits if you can. But depending on where you live, again, the hourly rate will vary, and it's typically per child. And I think that's really important to understand. The starting rate where I live is about $25 an hour, and that's usually for one child. And for every additional child is an additional $3 to $5. And so for us, a nanny would be about $40 an hour, $35 to $40 an hour for our 4 children. And you also have to pay overtime, all of these things. So, it is an expensive childcare option, but it is often more flexible than daycare, right? You can flex your hours. You can make them work for your family. You can do weekends, evenings. You have a little bit more leeway. They can make food. They can do laundry if that's part of your kind of contract with them. And then there's au pairs, which I think are often somewhat misunderstood, but au pairs are a cultural exchange program, and they're not meant to be like solely a childcare program. It is meant to be a cultural exchange. I'm very familiar with the au pair program because I had au pairs growing up. I had like 10 or 12 au pairs growing up.
Mm.
And what most people don't realize is you pay an agency fee. It's typically $10,000 a year for an au pair. And that covers things like the visa, transportation, etc. Then you have to pay an education fee. Typically, you have to pay for the flight, obviously room and board. Depending on where you live, you might need to be paying for a car insurance, cell phone, typically. And then it's typically throughout most of the United States, a weekly stipend. The au pair can work up to 45 hours a week, no more than 10 hours a day. And they get paid about $200 a week, which is nothing. It is, in my opinion, exploitative at that point when you're working 45 hours for like $4 an hour. And then, but in the state of Massachusetts where I live, we actually have the Domestic Workers' Rights Act. And so an au pair in Massachusetts will be paid minimum wage no matter what. They will get overtime. And so, throughout the US, an au pair is like $20,000 a year. In Massachusetts, you're going to be paying closer to $40,000, $50,000 depending
Do they live
on your
with you?
hours. They live in your home. Exactly.
Okay.
They live in your home. And they are not often trained childcare providers. They are part of a cultural exchange. So there's a bit more work involved and risk depending on how you see it when it comes to the actual care of your children. I think the au pair program can be amazing. There's a push federally to do what Massachusetts has done. across the entire country to pay them an hourly wage. In accordance to where you're located, right? So if you're in San Francisco, I think they were like saying like you need to be paying $18 an hour, $20 an hour, because $200 a week is just not a livable wage.
Right, right.
I've talked to au pairs who are in San Francisco and they just can't afford to do anything. They can't even go out to eat. It's just too expensive with what they're being paid. So these are the different, these are the like primary childcare options you're going to hear about. And then obviously, I think one that people really rely on is family and the unpaid labor and or low wage of a grandma or a sister or an aunt
Right.
watching your child, which is incredibly common right now because there is no childcare. People can't find it. And so they're relying on family to help support them.
As a Modern Husbands podcast listener, you recognize the importance of evidence-based advice from leading national experts for your marriage. That's why we know you will love our marriage toolkit. Nearly 50 national experts came together to provide bite-sized advice to manage the toughest topics couples face in managing money in the home as a team. Go to modernhusbands.com for your free preview of our marriage toolkit to start, strengthen, or rebuild your marriage. Once again, that's modernhusbands.com to sign up for your free preview of our marriage toolkit. Now back to the show.
Well, if you're listening and you're thinking as you are going through all of those options, oh, this is great. Once our kids hit 7, this will all be gone. Think again. Actually, I have close friends who had, I guess you would define them as a nanny from would be like 2 to 7 every day because they both have big jobs and they just don't have time to cook and clean and prepare dinner and pick the kids up in the middle of a work hour. Like school's out at 3:00, which is so not awesome if you have a corporate job. And they both had big jobs. So the nanny would pick them up from school. They would get them to whatever sports activities they had, and that's, they were like 11 and 13. It's just the reason that we're bringing this up is that when you are family planning, when you're trying to decide how many children to have, when you're trying to decide what it's going to cost, you need to map these things out. And there's oftentimes I have been told by even family members when I ask them, how are you going to pay for that? Like the answer is, oh, we'll figure it out. And I just cringe. I just think, oh my God, you have to figure out first and then make decisions. So we want to make sure that folks like kind of know what they're getting into, not just the financial cost, but the weight of the emotional weight of being a good parent and being a good spouse. Speaking of which, being a good parent, like as your kids grow, it's really important that you have shared parenting styles. So how is it that you and your husband are on the same page for your children? Because they're at that age where that's really important.
We weren't always, and we aren't always. What I think is most important is that you're communicating as often as possible, as in advance of something, but also as things come up, but not in front of your children, right? So something might happen.
Right.
And my husband and I are approaching it in different ways. And oftentimes what I've found is sometimes one parent's more informed, right? They've done the research on it, or they've been talking to the doctor about it, or the therapist, or whatever it is. They're more informed. Other times we are basing our decision making off of our own lived experiences, off of how we were parented, any kind of things that we hated or loved about how our parents treated us, right? There are certain things that I know that my parents did that I would never do, or that they did that I did like, right? And so I might do something in a moment because it's what I know, not necessarily because I'm more informed on it, right? And so it's important in those moments, if we disagree, to make sure we circle back to it, not in front of the children. We definitely have made the mistake when our kids were younger to be like, no, don't do that. This is why, in front of the kids. And that's not great. Obviously my kids were babies, so like they didn't understand, but we learned quickly that we didn't want to do that in front of our children. And so if something comes up, we make sure to be intentional about talking about it later. Food is a big one that I think a lot of women think about a lot, because obviously diet culture has been very prevalent in our lives. And so I'll say to my husband, I have 3 daughters, hey, when we talk about food, please don't use these words. And this is why, like, I don't want them growing up believing this food is good or bad. I don't want them to feel guilty if they eat that, or if they gain weight or lose weight. I don't want those things to be weighing on them, right? And in his mind, it hadn't even occurred. had not even occurred to him that that was maybe something that would come from what he was doing. And so being intentional, having those conversations as things come up and or in advance of them if you can. If you're doing the research, I brought up informed parenting. Like I often think about choking hazards, right? Like I know to cut the grapes because I know they're a choking hazard. And my husband's like, are they really? And I'm like, yeah, really. Like they are. And the doctor will tell you this. And I tend to be the person at doctor's appointments. And so I I was informed and I educated him and I said, hey, this is a huge choking hazard. We're going to cut them until they're X years old. And even past that, if we need to, we're buying a grape cutter on Amazon. It'll take you 2 seconds, right? And we have those conversations in advance of giving our kids grapes, right? Whatever it might be. And that's a silly one, but it's also an important one. And so that's how I think about it. I think parenting styles are, I don't know if our parents thought about this. I don't know about you, Brian, if you even thought about it, but like, I don't remember my mom being like, I'm a gentle parent or I'm an authoritative parent, right? But everything has a name now, everything has a title. And I think you get to figure out what works for your family and you don't have to assign a name to it. Like, I don't say I'm any kind of parent. I just am what I am. And my husband and I are aligned on things that we feel strongly about and we learn as we go. But for some people, that is important.
I was a teacher, so I get kind of wonky in this area. I grew up thinking a lot about it, and my mom was a teacher. However, when you dive into all these different strategies, there's one thing that you need to do where if you don't do it, the strategies are out the window, and that is always get each other's back. So you just have to make a decision, and whatever that decision is, you don't bend, because the kids, as they get older, they'll find a kink in the armor and they'll just keep on striking at it. There's 50 years ago, and it still happens today, but it's really common to see, even like the t-shirts will say it, go ask your mom. And it's really odd, and there's something, although there's obviously a lot wrong with that, and we can talk about that, but there's something that is super right about how that plays out that makes those two better parents. And that's that, if, at least in my household, it was go ask your mom, and whatever she said, my dad just got her back. That's simple. Yeah. There was never any moment where my dad broke down. He would just be like, no, it's up to your mom, and whatever she says goes for you and for me. And that's the way it's going to be. And that, because it was consistent, was effective. Now, is go ask your mom effective if you're operating as a team? No, because then mom gets just hammered with every request and decision. So to be very clear, that's not the way to do it. But if you are going to decide on, like, as you were talking about, all the strategies you talked about were right on. But the number one thing that I found you need to do is get each other's back. Whatever said, you got to support one another. And I'm so glad you said, don't talk about it in front of them. That's a mistake that I've made.
Yeah, I think we all make it. And I also think in the moment, right, if you're disagreeing, to your point, having each other's back, have an agreed upon way of doing it, right? Maybe one of you is more risk tolerant and one is not. But maybe you decide in the moment that you always defer to the least amount of risk, right? Because you'd rather have that conversation. So if you're saying yes, she's saying no, you defer to the no, right? For both ways, right? Because you want to make sure that you're respecting each other. So if one parent is a hard no, then you always defer to the no, or whatever it might be, right? You get to decide on what that looks like for your family. But having that also agreed upon in advance. So it's not just backing up your partner when you are actually very nervous and scared about something. You could just say like, hey, we agreed to default to the no. So today's a
that is a great piece of advice. I love that.
Yeah, it's helpful. if you stick to it, it can be helpful.
So speaking of that, like, what is, based on our conversation today, what is one piece of simple and actionable advice that you want to share with our listeners that they can apply in their lives?
That's a big question. That's a huge question. I think my biggest advice is to have the hard conversations early. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we like to think about things in terms of them being all good, right? We're getting married. This is so exciting. Let's talk about the wedding. Let's talk about the flowers and the honeymoon. But we don't go, okay, well, what does marriage mean for us? How are we sharing finances? I'm excited to marry you, but like, what does that mean for like retirement? Are we combining bank account? Whatever it is. Hey, I'm so excited. We're pregnant. Okay, well, let's start talking about how we're going to handle sick days when our kids are sick. right? Like, as
Right.
opposed to what we typically do is we hit a point where our kid is in daycare and they're getting sick every other day, and we're frustrated with each other saying, I'm always taking the sick days. And he's like, well, my job's not flexible. And, you're fighting about it, as opposed to having had the conversation early, which was, our kids are going to get sick when they enter childcare. How do we plan to tackle that? Right?
Yeah.
We often wait for those things to happen to decide how we're going to figure it out. But you can have those conversations early. And if you have those conversations early, you're better prepared to tackle them. I know living in the moment is fun, and I don't want to take all the joy out of marriage and being a parent, but having these conversations in advance actually makes it so those moments are more joyful as opposed to stressful, because that's what they will be. They will just end up being stressful if you don't have a plan of how you're going to tackle them.
Perfectly said. Thank you for joining us today, Paige.
Thank you.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow Modern Husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.